What if the stories you heard as a child were never meant to teach, but to remember? Not clearly, not completely, but softly. The way a dream remembers a place you once lived in, long before you knew its name. What if the oldest myths were not inventions at all, but echoes, fragments of a world that did not end in fire or noise, but faded gently like evening light withdrawing from stone? And what if something within you already recognizes that feeling, not as imagination, but as familiarity? It is possible that long before written history, before the careful carving of dates into memory, humanity learned a different way of surviving loss. Not by preserving facts, not by recording events in rigid order, but by letting experience dissolve into story, into symbol. Some ancient traditions suggest that the most important truths were never meant to be spoken directly. They were meant to be carried quietly, hidden inside tales of gods and floods and wandering heroes, so that even when the details were forgotten, the feeling would remain. If we listen closely to these myths, not as literal accounts, but as softened reflections, a pattern begins to emerge. Again and again, cultures separated by oceans speak of an earlier age, one that was closer to the earth, closer to the sky, closer to something that has since withdrawn. They speak of a time before the break, before the long forgetting. Yet what is striking is not the violence of these endings, but their gentleness. Waters rise not as sudden walls, but as slow, inevitable returns. Cities are not destroyed in screams, but abandoned in silence. The old world does not collapse, it recedes. What if this is because the ending itself was quiet? Imagine a world shaped not by catastrophe, but by gradual change. Seasons stretching longer than memory, shorelines shifting so slowly that generations adapt without naming the loss. Knowledge not erased, but no longer needed, and so gently set aside. In such a world there would be no moment worth marking as the end, only a long twilight where the familiar becomes distant, and the distant becomes myth. It is possible that the people who lived through this transition did not see themselves as survivors. They may have believed they were simply moving on, guided by rhythms older than fear, and yet something within them resisted, complete forgetting they encode their memories in stories, not because they expected them to be understood, but because they hoped they would be felt. A flood becomes a cleansing, a vanished land becomes a paradise lost, a collapse becomes a cycle destined to repeat, but never exactly the same way. Some ancient traditions suggest that memory itself behaves like water. It does not vanish when a container breaks. It seeps into the ground, into the cracks of language and ritual, into gestures repeated without explanation. Over time, these seep memories harden into myth, no longer recognizable as history, yet still shaping how people understand the world and their place within it. What if this is why so many myths describe humanity as arriving, rather than beginning, as emerging into a world already formed? The first people are often taught by beings who seem older than the land itself, beings who know things humanity does not remember learning. Perhaps these figures are not gods at all, but reflections of those who came before, seen through the softening lens of time. In this way, myths may not describe a golden age destroyed by hubris, but a complex world slowly simplified, technologies becoming unnecessary, systems of knowledge dissolving as environments. Change, a civilization not wiped away, but absorbed, its structures dismantled, not by force, but by irrelevance. What if the most unsettling part of this story is not that such a world might have existed, but that it ended without protest, that there was no single moment of terror to burn into collective memory, only adaptation, followed by forgetting? And what if forgetting itself was chosen, not consciously, but instinctively, as a form of mercy? Sleep comes more easily when the past does not scream. Some ancient traditions suggest that after the old world faded, humanity became quieter. Stories grew shorter, lives narrowed, attention turned inward, toward immediate horizons. In this shrinking, something essential may have been lost, but something else was gained. The ability to live without constant remembrance. The capacity to begin again without the weight of knowing how much had already been known. What if myths are the compromise between remembering and letting go? They do not tell us what happened. They tell us how it felt, the sadness of leaving a coastline behind, the relief of not having to maintain what could no longer be sustained, the strange calm of realizing that the world is older than any one way of living in it. This would explain why these stories are so difficult to interpret literally. They resist clarity. They contradict themselves. They shift like reflections on water. Perhaps this is intentional. A precise memory would invite contemplation. Imagine a child thousands of years ago listening to a story about a great flood. They do not picture walls of water crashing down. They feel instead a sense of transition, of movement, of something inevitable and slow. They feel that the world can change, and that life continues, though not in the same way. Without knowing it, they are inheriting a memory of adaptation. What if the real warning and code in these myths is not about divine punishment, but about impermanence? About the quiet truth that no way of living lasts forever, and that endings do not always announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive disguised as normality. In this sense, the myths are not about the past alone. They are mirrors held gently toward every present. They remind us that we too live in a moment that will one day feel like a beginning to those who come after, even if we experience it as an ending. It is possible that this is why these stories were told at night. Why they were shared around fires in low voices, without urgency. They were not meant to alarm, but to settle. To teach the nervous system how to accept change without panic. To say softly, "This has happened before," and life continued. If ancient myths are memories of a world that ended softly, then they are also instructions. Not instructions for survival in a technical sense, but for emotional continuity, for carrying meaning forward even when structures dissolve, for allowing memory to blur without disappearing. And perhaps this is why, even now, these stories feel strangely comforting. They speak of loss, yet they do not frighten us. They speak of endings, yet they do not demand action. They simply sit beside us like an old presence, reminding us that the world has always been in the process of becoming something else. What if, as you listen to these myths, something within you recognizes that rhythm, not because you remember the old world, but because you are part of the long forgetting that followed. And in that forgetting there is rest. The past does not need to be recovered. It needs only to be acknowledged, gently, before sleep. And as the stories fade into silence, they do what they were always meant to do. They let go, once more, without resistance. In that silence something subtle remains, like the warmth left in stone after the sun has gone. It is possible that the people who lived closer to that earlier world understood silence differently than we do now. Silence was not absence, it was a presence without edges. It was the space in which memory could soften without breaking. When they spoke of gods withdrawing, or ancestors disappearing beneath water or earth, they may have been describing not loss but distance, a growing space between what was once immediate and what could only be felt indirectly. Some ancient traditions suggest that after the quiet ending, humanity learned to live among remnants without recognizing them as such. Hills that were once structures, fields that were once meeting places, rivers that followed paths laid down for other purposes. Over time, the origin of these forms became unimportant. Memory, stripped of urgency, became landscape. What if this is why so many myths describe sacred places that feel older than their stories? Stones that hum with meaning but offer no explanation, ruins whose builders are unnamed, whose intentions are never clarified. These are not failures of record. They may be signs of intentional forgetting. The knowledge of how and why may have been allowed to dissolve, because carrying it forward would have been heavier than letting it go. It is possible that the people who came after sensed this weight without understanding its source. They inherited a world already simplified, already quieter, and yet they felt a faint pressure, a sense that something vast had receded just beyond reach. To explain this feeling, they turned to story, not to reconstruct the past accurately, but to give shape to an absence. In these stories, the old world often appears as a place of abundance, of closeness between beings, of long lifespans, and deep understanding. This may not be nostalgia in the usual sense. It may be the emotional residue of complexity remembered without detail. When systems collapse gently, what remains is not fear, but longing, a sense that life was once layered in ways that are now difficult to imagine. What if the mythic golden age is not an exaggeration, but a simplification in the opposite direction? A single image standing in for countless interconnect realities that no longer exist. When those realities faded, the memory compressed, becoming symbolic rather than specific. Gold, because it does not tarnish. An age, because it cannot be placed. Some ancient traditions suggest that time itself behaved differently in that earlier world, not because clocks ran slower, but because attention did. Lives were shaped by cycles so extended that urgency had little meaning. In such a context, the end of a way of living would not feel abrupt. It would feel like a gradual turning, a shift in emphasis rather than a rupture. As environments changed, as climates softened or hardened, as coastlines withdrew or advanced, people adjusted their stories accordingly. What could no longer be seen was not denied. It was transformed. The sea that reclaimed land became a conscious force. The ice that retreated became a memory of giants sleeping. The sky that changed its patterns became the realm of distant watchers. In this way, myth becomes a bridge between perception and acceptance. It does not insist on accuracy. It offers meaning where precision would only create grief. To say that a god chose to leave is less painful than to say that a world became uninhabitable. To say that an age ended because of moral decline is easier than to accept that complexity has limits. What if this is why these stories persist? Even when their literal interpretations fail, they are not meant to be proven or disproven. They are meant to be lived with. Like weather, their truth is not in their details, but in their emotional utility. Consider how often these myths emphasize listening rather than acting. Warnings are given, but they are rarely clear. Instructions are offered, but they are symbolic. The point is not to prevent the ending. The ending has already happened. The point is to learn how to exist afterward without despair. It is possible that humanity, in its earliest remembered form, was already post-collapse, that what we call civilization is not the first flowering, but a regrowth from quieter roots. If so, then our myths are not origin stories. They are after stories, accounts of how it feels to begin again without fully understanding what was lost. This perspective shifts something subtle in the way the past is felt. Instead of standing at the beginning of a long ascent, we stand somewhere along a long oscillation, rising and simplifying, remembering and forgetting. Each phase believing itself to be new while carrying traces of earlier rhythms. What if the sense of restlessness that appears again and again in human culture is not dissatisfaction with the present, but resonance with an older pattern? A memory of having lived within broader systems now reduced. A feeling that something essential is missing even if it cannot be named. Myths give this feeling a place to settle. They allow it to exist without demanding resolution. By telling and retelling these stories, people learn to sit with incompleteness, to accept that understanding has limits and that not everything that mattered can be recovered. Some ancient tradition suggests that there were those who tried to preserve more, builders, keepers of knowledge, but even in these stories, preservation is partial. Libraries burn, teachings are misunderstood. What survives is always less than what existed. This is not portrayed as failure, but as inevitability. What if the softness of the ending was matched by a softness in what followed? No single authority, no unified memory, just scattered continuities. In this scattering, humanity becomes diverse, not because of progress, but because of separation. Each group carries a different fragment of the same long story. This could explain why flood myths vary so widely, yet feel emotionally similar. The water rises in different ways, the survivors are different, the lessons change. But beneath these variations is a shared tone of resignation rather than terror. The sense that what is happening cannot be stopped, only endured. In listening to these stories now, it is tempting to search for warnings or predictions. But perhaps that impulse misses their deeper function. They are not telling us what will happen. They are showing us how people once felt when change exceeded their ability to respond directly. They show us that it is possible to survive, not by resisting transformation, but by yielding to it thoughtfully, by allowing identity to become fluid, by letting memory blur where clarity would wound. What if this is why these myths often end quietly? After the flood recedes, after the old order dissolves, there is rarely a triumphant rebuilding. There is planting, there is walking, there is naming. Small acts grounded in immediate reality. The future begins not with grand designs, but with attention. Attention to seasons, attention to animals, attention to stories themselves. As time passes, the original context of these myths becomes less important than the rhythm they carry. They are told and retold because they create a certain inner state. Calm acceptance, a readiness to sleep in a world that is always changing. Perhaps this is the most enduring inheritance of the world that ended softly, not tools or structures, but a psychological adaptation, a way of relating to impermanence without collapse. And if that is so, then listening to these stories now is not an act of curiosity alone. It is a continuation of a very old practice, sitting with uncertainty, allowing questions to remain unanswered, letting the past be present without demanding it explain itself. The world before history may never be known in detail, but its echo persists, not as data but as atmosphere, a faint pressure in the background of human thought, a reminder that what feels stable is always provisional, and that endings do not always arrive with force. Sometimes they arrive like sleep, slowly, quietly, without resistance. And in that quiet, life goes on not unchanged, but unbroken. In the unbroken flow of that continuation, it is possible to imagine that those who lived closest to the soft ending developed a different relationship with loss itself. Loss was not framed as a sudden absence, but as a thinning, like fog lifting from a valley, revealing less detail with each passing moment, yet never fully disappearing. What remained was enough to orient oneself, enough to move forward without panic. Some ancient traditions suggest that names once carried more weight than they do now. To name something was to hold it in being. When the old world began to fade, names may have been the first things to loosen their grip. Places renamed, Zois simplified, complex identities reduced to functions that could be remembered easily. In this way, forgetting became a collective act, shared rather than imposed. What if the first myths were spoken, not to preserve knowledge, but to regulate emotion, to prevent grief from overwhelming the ability to adapt? A story of gods departing is gentler than the truth of systems failing. A tale of chosen survivors is kinder than the reality of slow dispersal. Through myth, pain is given form without sharp edges. As generations passed, those edges softened further. What was once a memory of transition became a story of origins. The sense of coming from somewhere else, of inheriting rather than inventing, remained embedded in language. People spoke of ancestors emerging from caves, from water, from the earth itself. These are not beginnings in the absolute sense. They are arrivals. It is possible that this is why so many cultures describe humanity as younger than the world it inhabits. Mountains are old, rivers are old. Even the land seems to remember something beyond human presence. This perception may not be philosophical, it may be inherited intuition, a recognition that the world has already lived through other arrangements before the current one took shape in such a context. Humility is not learned, it is assumed. The idea that humans are temporary guests rather than permanent owners feels natural. When change comes, it is met with resignation rather than outrage. The earth does not betray, it simply continues. Some ancient traditions suggest that after the quiet ending, storytelling itself changed. Stories became less precise, more cyclical endings blended into beginnings. Characters transformed rather than died. This narrative fluidity mirrors an experience of time that is no longer linear. When a world ends softly, it does not create a clear before and after, it creates overlap. What if this overlap is still present within us? A faint layering of temporal awareness that occasionally surfaces as déjà as an unplaceable sense of having been here before, not as an individual but as a pattern, a recognition of familiar transits, would mean that myths are not distant relics but active processes. They continue to shape perception long after their original contexts are gone. They teach the nervous system how to move through uncertainty, how to accept ambiguity without freezing, how to sleep even when the ground beneath identity is shifting. It is possible that the calm tone of these stories is their most important feature. They do not insist, they unfold. This unfolding mirrors the way the old world may have ended, not with alarms, but with adjustments, not with commands, but with gradual consent. Consent to change, consent to simplification, consent to not knowing everything that was once known. Some ancient traditions suggest that there were moments when remembering too much was seen as dangerous. Those who clung to the old ways too tightly could not adapt. Their grief hardened into rigidity. Their knowledge became unusable. In stories they appear as figures frozen in time, turned to stone, lost beneath water, or sealed away. These are not punishment. They are metaphors for immobility in contrast. The survivors in these myths are rarely heroes in the modern sense. They are listeners. They follow signs they do not fully understand. They carry fragments rather than wholes. Their strength lies in flexibility, not mastery. What if this is the real lesson and code beneath the surface? That survival after a soft ending requires a willingness to live with partial understanding. To accept that clarity is not always beneficial. That some things must remain indistinct in order to be carried forward. As the myths pass through centuries, they lose their connection to specific. Their coastline becomes universal. A mountain that once marked a boundary becomes cosmic. This expansion is not exaggeration, it is abstraction. The story sheds its local details so it can travel. In traveling, it changes those who hear it, not by informing them, but by attuning them, creating a shared emotional vocabulary for dealing with loss and renewal. Across cultures, across distances, people learn to recognize the same underlying mood, a quiet sorrow, a steady patience, a trust that life continues in altered forms. It is possible that this shared mood is the true continuity of humanity. Not genetics alone, not technology, but a transmitted way of feeling time, a way of inhabiting a world that is never certain. When listening to these stories now, especially in moments of rest, something ancient may be reactivated. Not a memory of events, but a memory of coping. The body relaxes, the mind loosens its grip, the need for certainty fades. What if this is why such stories are suited to sleep? Sleep itself is a daily rehearsal of soft endings. Consciousness withdraws without drama. Identity dissolves temporarily. In the morning, something returns, familiar yet slightly altered. Each night we practice letting go. Each morning we practice beginning again, without needing to know exactly where we have been. The world that ended softly may not be a single lost civilization or epic. It may be a recurring condition, a phase that repeats whenever complexity reaches a point of unsustainability, when systems grow too intricate, too dependent, too fragile. They do not always shatter, sometimes they simplify. They are memories of simplification. They remind us that reduction is not always failure, that narrowing can be a form of survival, that losing detail does not mean losing meaning. Some ancient traditions suggest that after each soft ending, humanity becomes quieter for a time, less ambitious, more attentive. Over generations, complexity slowly returns. New stories are told. Eventually, another thinning begins. This cycle is not moral, it is ecological. It reflects the rhythms of the world itself. What if recognizing this cycle brings a kind of peace, not resignation, but perspective, the understanding that no single arrangement is final, the beginnings and endings of the other. As the stories fade toward silence, they do not conclude, they rest. They wait to be spoken again, altered slightly by each voice. In this way, the past remains present without demanding dominance. Perhaps the greatest gift of the world that ended softly is this capacity for rest, that life knows how to reorganize itself quietly, if given time. And so the myths remain not as records to be decoded, but as companions sitting beside us in the dark, breathing slowly, reminding us, without words, that what has happened before can happen again, and that this does not mean everything is lost, only that everything changes. And in that change, there is continuity. A continuity gentle enough to sleep within.